evening, everybody. This is Katje. Welcome to my YouTube channel. This evening I am wearing what I like to call my New Wave Catholic Schoolgirl outfit. This is another Forever 21 miniskirt that I bought. Has a nice plaid pattern on it. I'm wearing it this evening with my fishnet stockings and also with my Calvin Klein high heels, my black leather high heels, and this white tee. So let me model that look for you. Here's the back. Here's the side. The other side. And here you can see the fishnets with the black heels. So this is a very funky, kind of edgy outfit, but has a little bit of tradition in it as well. Tonight I wanted to go on a little bit more about a theme that I was discussing last time, and that has to do with criteria for evaluating very contemporary art, particularly art that is designated as conceptual often. So I gave a couple of examples last time, and this time what I want to do is say a little bit more by means of a kind of more general rule of thumb for approaching these kinds of works when you go into a modern gallery and maybe being forearmed or having some ideas about how to approach this work and maybe reach some kind of judgment about whether a particular work succeeds or maybe it doesn't succeed. So let's talk about that a little bit, and what I want to do is start out by not talking about contemporary conceptual art, but maybe just use a couple of examples of more traditional art. And what I want to do with that is kind of set up a thought experiment that will help you when you go to a gallery to make the kinds of evaluations that will help you appreciate conceptual art more. And I'll give a couple of examples. So maybe the first thing that we should discuss is, well, what is the right question to ask about this kind of art? And a question that typically gets asked is, well, is it art? What is art? Are these works really art? Is a Duchamp urinal, say, a work of art, or is one of his ready-mades a work of art or not? And people get all exercise over this question they have for decades. And my feeling about that is that really is not the right question to ask. Maybe it's art, maybe it's not. Who really cares? We could sit around all day debating what art is and trying to come up with necessary and sufficient conditions for that. But I think that's a waste of time. I think a better question to ask is, well, is this particular work or this particular object that is designated as conceptual art or ultra-contemporary art, even if it's not art, let's forget about that word altogether. Is this thing, is this object something that is interesting in a certain way or not? And I think the question or the key or a key to evaluating these works is to ask and to ascertain whether they are interesting in the way that I'm going to describe or not. If the answer to that question is yes, then that's a valuable work of conceptual art. And if the answer is no, then it's not so good. So now let me go back to just a couple of examples from traditional art. And what I'm going to do is then triangulate from that to contemporary art to make my case. So let's imagine that somebody painted an amateur, a very introductory level artist or an amateur, paints a watercolor of, I don't know, a rose, a flower. And it's sort of a typical work that you might find at an auction or an estate sale or something like that. And so it's okay, it doesn't have a lot of technique. It's not very interesting, but it does represent a flower, and the colors are right and the shape is right. And so on a very fundamental level, it succeeds as a painting of a rose or a particular flower, but beyond that is kind of like, well, that's not very interesting. Okay, I'm done with that. I've seen it one time, and then I don't ever really think about it again because it doesn't interest me. It doesn't have any depth. it doesn't have any sophistication or complexity that would make me want to come back to it. Now let's contrast that with another work. Let's say we were talking about one of Van Gogh's paintings, say his paintings of irises, where there's the beautiful white iris in the middle of a field of blue or purplish irises. And so let's look at that. And this painting would be interesting. There's a lot of complexity in there. The composition is very turgid. It's very expressionist. It's something that you want to look at. Or you might want to look at it again. It would interest you in a certain way. You could see all kinds of different things going on in there. And the colors are not exactly the way they are in the real world. And yet they do seem to express certain emotions. The point is that you would want what would make sense for you to want to come back and look at that again. You might dream about it at night. You might think about it at times when you're not there. It's interesting. It's something that you want to return to, either literally, by going back to the gallery to see it again, or maybe looking at it in an art book again, or just thinking about it. Now, I want to say that the same kind of point will help us to determine whether a particular work of conceptual art is interesting or not. So let me give some examples. So let's go back to the example of the amateur painting of a flower, and let's take a work of conceptual art, a hypothetical work, that would be like that. It would be very simple. So suppose that somebody installs in a gallery the following sculpture or installation. On the one hand, there's a model of a housefly, and on the other side of the installation, right next to it, there's a model of a knight in armor. So maybe you have a fly and you have a knight in armor, and so you look at this and they're sort of mundane objects. So what is it? And so you look at it for a while, and then you realize, oh, it's kind of like a visual riddle. It's fly by night, fly by night. And so then you figured it out. And once you figured it out, you say, okay, well, that's kind of an interesting idea, but now that I figured it out, like most riddles, it doesn't really interest me anymore. So because I've now solved it, it's pretty straightforward once I think about it. And so that's it. And I don't come back to it. I might remember it every now and then, but I don't really think about it anymore because I solved the riddle. It's no longer interesting to me, just like the painting, the amateur painting of the flower is no longer interesting to me because I've sort of gotten to the bottom of it, and it didn't take me very long to do that. Now, let's go to another example of conceptual art that's not like that. And this is a work that can be seen in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of this work, but it's in the contemporary wing of the gallery. And basically what it is, it's very simple, but it is a circle of very rough and rugged stones laid out almost like the way they would around a campfire, except here they're laid out in a stone circle on the floor of the gallery. Now, when you walk into this, all of a sudden this very strange object, this very strange installation has a kind of force. In other words, you're not sure whether you should step over it. Is it okay for me to step into the circle of stones, or should I treat it like, let's say, a painting, a rare painting by Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo? I don't want to touch it. I don't want to get too close to it. I should stay back. And yet it is just a circle of stones. And it has this kind of mysterious aura. So I might go to the gallery and I might experience that and think about it and not really be able to unravel it or untie the knot. And I might go home and think about it. I might find myself dreaming about it or lying awake at night in bed thinking about it. And maybe it brings to mind a kind of interesting series of ideas about art and its relation to what is permitted, what is forbidden, what is primitive, because it is a stone circle. It's reminiscent of a prehistoric fire circle or something like that. It has this kind of primitive quality that sort of prickles your skin when you think about it. And a whole chain of ideas is unleashed by this particular installation that keeps me thinking about it, that makes me maybe want to keep thinking about it, maybe even to go back and look at it again. It's also reminiscent of the old story that, well, a witch is not supposed to walk under a ladder, and so there's a ladder, and so if somebody says, well, are you a witch or not? And you might feel the same kind of trepidation, this sort of approach, avoidance, tension that goes back, in this case, to folklore or to mythology or all kinds of stories like that, myth. So all of these ideas get unleashed by this particular object in the gallery that makes it interesting, that makes it something that you want to keep thinking about, that makes it something that you want to go back to, perhaps. Now, let me give another example, and this was displayed many years ago, in the Xoxo Library at the University of Washington in Seattle, Washington. And again, I'm sorry, I don't remember the name of the work, but basically what it was like a hut that had an entrance that was installed in the middle of the library, but it was pitch dark in the hut. And so the viewers were invited to go into this dark enclosed space very carefully. I think there was like a guideline or something that would lead you in. And then there was like in the middle of this space, this dark space, pitch black. In the middle of it, there was like this very weak flame. It was almost like phosphorus or something like that. It was a very weak glow that really didn't illuminate the walls. And so you would go in there, and what was interesting was that you didn't know whether somebody else was already in there or not. And I think that this was intentionally done by the artist who created that object. We don't know who else might be in there or not. And it's a kind of strange, almost eerie experience, because not only are you presenting yourself in this dark space where somebody else might be wondering the same thing, well, is there anybody else in here besides me? But you're thinking the same thing about that. It also conjures up ideas of night versus day, again being in a shelter, in a strange place, all kinds of interesting ideas, in particular about selfhood and anonymity, and maybe even sensory deprivation. Who am I? Am I still, is myself, what is that self in a sensory deprivation tank? What is myself? What is the core of myself? Is that something given, or is that something that I make? And how does it show up to other people? And how do they show up to me in this very mysterious situation? That whole chain of ideas is unleashed by that work. And so that's something that is interesting in the sense that it might make me want to think more about it. It might make me want to read more about it or return to it and experience it again. It's interesting in the way that the stone circle at the Philadelphia Art Museum is interesting, at least potentially, and in a way that both the Van Gogh painting too of the iris is interesting, but certainly not the simple amateurish painting of a flower or a rose, or that riddle work that I gave where it's fly by night. That's a very simple, uninteresting work of conceptual art, or if you don't want to call it art, just a conceptual object, but it's not as interesting or as valuable as the works that I just discussed, because once you see it and figure it out, you're done with it. You can wash your hands of it. It's not something that you really think about again. It's a riddle that you solved, and so you put it in the shelf, and put it on the shelf, and you don't think about it again. So my suggestion is, to conclude this evening's video, my suggestion is that at least one criterion for approaching some of these more contemporary conceptual objects is not to ask, well, is this a work of art? Forget about that question. Who cares? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. The really important question, it seems to me, is to ask ourselves, well, is this particular object or installation or event or whatever it is this particular thing interesting in the sense that it encourages us to think more about it, to return to it in our minds, in our experience, or not? If the answer to that question is yes, then we have a relatively valuable work of conceptual art or a conceptual object. If it isn't, if it's more like fly by night, then it is fly by night. It's not interesting. It's not, therefore, it's not particularly valuable as a conceptual work of art, or forgetting the term art altogether, which basically has no sense anymore that I can tell, is it an interesting conceptual art object or not? And in this case, it would be. So that's what I wanted to say this evening, and I hope that you'll find these remarks helpful, and maybe it will encourage some of you who haven't gone to contemporary exhibits to do so, and maybe some of you who have gone, maybe this will enable you to get a little more out of the experience, because it can be quite interesting, and when something is interesting, we want to fill our lives with interesting things, because that makes life more interesting, and it enriches life. It brings a greater depth and weight to life. So that's what art or non-art or conceptual things, when they work, that's what they do. So that's what I wanted to say this evening. Thank you so much for joining me and letting me model my outfit and share some of my ideas. This is Katje Eckhart, and until next time, I wish everybody, as always, a safe and a restful and a peaceful good evening. Thank you so much for your patience, and thank you for joining me. Until next time, this is Katje. Bye-bye.